At 2 a.m. on February 14, 1945, Sergeant Red Miller sat in the open bucket seat of an M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, parked in a muddy clearing on the island of Luzon. He was 22 years old, soaking wet, and he was currently the most hated man in the entire sector. The vehicle beneath him was a 12-ton half-track, a hybrid machine with truck tires in the front and tank treads in the back. It was painted olive drab, but in the moonless dark of the Philippine jungle, it looked like a massive, jagged shadow. Miller wasn't looking at the sky, even though that was his job. He was looking at the tree line, less than 100 yards away. The jungle was a solid wall of black vines and rotting mahogany trees, and it was alive. He could hear the movement, the breaking of twigs, the shifting of wet leaves, and the low, heavy voices of men gathering for a rush. The Japanese Imperial Army was out there, massing for a counterattack, and Miller sat exposed in a metal chair, gripping the spade handles of a weapon that everyone told him was useless. The infantrymen of the 25th Division, dug into foxholes in a defensive semicircle around Miller's vehicle, looked at the half-track with pure disgust. To them, the machine was a liability. They called it the Dragon Wagon, or the Target Magnet. In a war fought by men crawling on their bellies through sludge, a 10-foot-tall truck was impossible to hide. It stuck out like a neon billboard in a graveyard. Every time Miller started the engine, the loud engine noise drew Japanese mortar fire. Every time he moved, the treads chewed up the only supply road, turning it into a river of chocolate pudding. The infantry captain had spent the last 3 days trying to get Miller sent back to the rear. He argued that an anti-aircraft weapon had no place on the front line. He screamed that there were no Japanese planes in the sky, so Miller was just a tourist parked in a combat zone, endangering real soldiers with his oversized toy. The weapon mounted on the back of the half-track was the M45 Quadmount. Even in the dark, it looked like something from a science fiction nightmare. It consisted of 4 M250 caliber machine guns mounted in a powered turret. The guns sat in pairs, 2 on the left and 2 on the right, flanking the gunner's armored seat like heavy steel wings. On paper, this was a precision instrument designed to track and destroy low-flying fighter planes. It had an electric motor and a small gasoline generator that powered the turret, allowing it to spin 60 degrees per second. It was fast, agile, and terrifyingly complex. But in the jungle, complex usually meant broken. The infantry preferred their simple water-cooled machine guns and reliable rifles. They looked at the Quadmount's wires, batteries, and generators and saw a maintenance disaster waiting to happen. They laughed at it. They asked Miller if he planned to shoot down coconuts. They told him to go back to the airfield, where the Air Force boys drank cold lemonade and pretended to fight a war. The criticism wasn't just about the size of the rig, it was about the doctrine. The U.S. Army manuals were clear. The M16 was an anti-aircraft asset. Its job was to protect bridges and supply depots from strafing Zeros. Using it for ground support was considered a waste of ammunition. A single 50 caliber round was the size of a Sharpie marker and cost real money. The Quadmount fired 2,000 of them in a minute. The logistics officers hated it because a single Quadmount could eat more ammo in 30 seconds than an entire rifle company used in a week. They viewed Miller as a parasite, sucking up resources to fire at ghosts. The infantry commanders saw him as a danger because the moment he opened fire, every Japanese artillery spotter within 5 miles would triangulate his position and rain high explosives on the entire platoon. So Miller sat in the rain, feeling the heavy isolation of a man who knows he is unwanted. He wiped the water off the optical sight, a reflex sight that projected a glowing red ring onto a glass plate. It was designed to lead fast-moving aircraft, calculating the deflection needed to hit a plane moving at 300 miles per hour. Against a man walking at 3 miles per hour, the sight was overkill. It was like using a telescope to read a newspaper, but Miller kept checking it anyway. He checked the ammunition chests, 4 massive steel tombstones bolted to the sides of the mount. Each chest held 200 rounds of linked ammunition. He checked the solenoids, the electric triggers that allowed him to fire all 4 guns with a single butterfly switch. He knew that if the infantry was right, he was just a sitting duck in a metal coffin. But if they were wrong, he was sitting in the pilot's seat of the deadliest lawnmower ever built. The situation on Luzon was desperate. The Japanese forces were not surrendering. They were digging into the volcanic caves and the dense bamboo thickets, fighting for every inch of ground. Their tactics had shifted from tactical maneuvers to suicidal charges. They called them Banzai attacks. At night, when the American air superiority was nullified by the darkness, they would gather in the jungle. They would drink sake, fix bayonets to their Arisaka rifles, and charge the American lines in human waves. They didn't care about survival. They cared about taking as many Americans with them as possible. The American infantry machine guns, the 30 caliber M1919s, were good weapons, but they had limits. They overheated. The barrels would glow cherry red and warp if fired too long. You had to change barrels, reload belts, and manage the heat. A human wave didn't give you time to let a barrel cool. It just kept coming like a tide of flesh and steel. Earlier that evening, the infantry captain had walked up to the half-track. He didn't look up at Miller. He just kicked the rubber track pad with a muddy boot. He told Miller that intelligence reported a massive buildup in the sector. A full battalion of Japanese infantry was moving through the ravine. The captain said his men were low on grenades and tired. He looked at the Quadmount and shook his head. He told Miller that when the shooting started, he should just keep his head down and not give away their position. He implied that the 4-gun turret was nothing more than a paperweight. He said that if Miller fired and drew mortar fire on his boys, he would shoot Miller himself. It was the ultimate vote of no confidence. The expert opinion was unanimous. The Dragon Wagon was useless in a ground fight. But as the hours ticked by, the jungle noise changed. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the sound of metal striking stone. It was the sound of heavy equipment being dragged through the mud. Miller felt a vibration in the floor of the turret. The enemy wasn't just patrolling, they were assembling. He reached down and started the auxiliary generator. The small gas engine hesitated and then ran with a steady, low tone. To the infantry nearby, the noise was annoying, another reason to hate the truck. But to Miller, it was the heartbeat of the machine. The generator charged the batteries that turned the turret. Without it, the guns were just dead weight. With it, the turret became a powered exoskeleton, responding to his slightest touch. He grabbed the control yoke. It looked like the handlebars of a bicycle, mounted vertically in front of his chest. He twisted the grip, and the massive turret traversed to the left. The electric motor emitted a high-pitched tone that cut through the humidity. He twisted it back, and the guns swung right. He pulled back on the handlebars, and the guns elevated toward the clouds. He pushed forward, and the 4 heavy barrels dipped low, pointing directly at the mud. The infantry captain had forgotten one thing about the M45. It was designed to track planes that could dive, climb, and bank. That meant the turret had incredible range of motion. It could depress the guns to -10 degrees. It could literally shoot the ground in front of the truck. Miller looked at the belts of ammunition hanging from the guns. Standard loadout for anti-aircraft work was a mix of ball, tracer, and armor-piercing rounds. But Miller had done something unauthorized. He had spent the afternoon stripping the belts and relinking them. He wasn't preparing for thin aluminum airplane skins. He was preparing for bunkers and logs. He loaded the belts with armor-piercing incendiary, API rounds. These bullets had a hardened tungsten core to punch through steel and a chemical tip that ignited on impact. They were designed to set fuel tanks on fire. Against soft targets like trees or sandbags, they acted like explosive matches. He also added extra tracers, one every 3 rounds instead of one every 5. He wanted to see exactly where his fire was going in the pitch black. The mocking voices of the infantry faded from his mind as the first flare ignited overhead. A mortar shell, fired by the Japanese to illuminate the battlefield, drifted down on a parachute. The magnesium flare bathed the clearing in a stark, flickering white light. The shadows danced and stretched. And then the wall of the jungle dissolved. It didn't melt, it parted. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stepped out of the tree line at once. They weren't hiding anymore, they were screaming. The sound was a guttural, terrifying roar that sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. They raised their rifles and began to run. The mud splashed under their boots. They were less than 80 yards away. The infantrymen in the foxholes opened fire. The heavy reports of the Garand rifles and the rapid cycling of the 30 caliber machine guns filled the air, but the wave didn't stop. The lead attackers fell, but the men behind them just stepped over the bodies. They were moving with a fanatical momentum. The American line was thin. The infantry was going to be overrun in less than 30 seconds. The captain was screaming orders, but his voice was lost in the chaos. This was the moment the experts had feared. The technical disadvantage of the riflemen was exposed. They couldn't shoot fast enough to stop the tide. Miller took a breath. He gripped the spade handles. He ignored the manual. He ignored the captain. He ignored the fact that he was an anti-aircraft gunner in a ground war. He pushed the handlebars forward, dipping the 4 barrels until they were level with the chests of the running men. He flipped the butterfly switch to all fire. The generator ran louder, anticipating the load. The Dragon Wagon wasn't a toy anymore. It was about to become the judge, jury, and executioner of the Luzon jungle. The infantry commanders crouching in the mud looked at the M16 half-track and saw a truck. They saw a clumsy, gasoline-thirsty vehicle that was impossible to hide and difficult to maneuver. But Sergeant Red Miller, sitting in the armored bucket seat of the Maxim turret, knew the truth. He wasn't sitting in a truck, he was sitting inside a robot. The M45 Quadmount was an engineering marvel that was decades ahead of its time. Unlike the infantry machine guns, which were aimed by human muscle and sweat, the Quadmount was powered by electricity. A small Briggs & Stratton gasoline engine mounted on the rear of the turret drove a generator, which charged a set of massive heavy-duty batteries. These batteries powered two electric motors, one for elevation and one for traverse. This meant that the four heavy machine guns, weighing over 300 pounds combined, felt weightless in Miller's hands. He didn't have to wrestle the weapon to aim it. He just had to apply a few pounds of pressure to the control yoke, and the turret responded instantly. It could spin a full 360 degrees in less than 6 seconds. It could snap from pointing at the clouds to pointing at the mud faster than a man could turn his head. It was a powered exoskeleton that turned a single human being into the fastest gunfighter in the Pacific. But the speed of the turret was only useful if the bullets hit something, and that was where Miller's MacGyver modification came into play. The Army manual stated that the guns should be harmonized, or aimed, to converge at a single point 600 yards away. This was perfect for hitting a Japanese Zero fighter plane diving at 300 miles per hour. It created a kill box in the sky where all four streams of bullets met, but Miller wasn't fighting planes. He was fighting infantry. At 600 yards, the jungle was so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Fighting in the jungle happened at 50 yards, maybe 100 if you were lucky. If he left the guns set to the factory standard, his bullets would be flying in parallel lines at close range, missing the targets in the middle. He needed the streams to meet right in front of the truck. So earlier that afternoon, while the infantry officers were mocking him, Miller had taken a wrench to the mounting bolts. He loosened the clamps that held the four M2 machine guns in place. He dragged a collection of empty ammunition crates out to a spot exactly 200 yards from the vehicle. He painted a white cross on the center crate. Then, he climbed back into the turret and adjusted the angle of each gun individually. He cranked them inward, forcing the barrels to look slightly cross-eyed. He adjusted them until the optical sight, the iron sights, and the bore of every gun were all staring at that single white cross. He created a ground convergence zone. It meant that at 200 yards, the four streams of lead would smash into a single point the size of a basketball. It was like taking the spray from a garden hose and focusing it down into a pressure washer. It turned the broad anti-aircraft spread into a concentrated laser beam of destruction. The final piece of Miller's unauthorized upgrade was the ammunition itself. The infantry machine gunners used standard ball ammunition, solid lead slugs wrapped in a copper jacket. These were fine for killing men, but they struggled against the dense cover of the jungle. A mahogany tree trunk could stop a standard .30 caliber bullet cold. The Japanese knew this, and they hid behind the massive root systems of the banyan trees, using the wood as natural armor. Miller decided to remove the wood from the equation. He spent hours breaking down the factory-linked belts of .50 caliber ammo and rebuilding them by hand. He swapped out the standard ball rounds for armor-piercing incendiary, or API. These bullets were nasty pieces of work. Inside the copper jacket was a penetrator made of tungsten steel, harder than tank armor. On the tip of the bullet was a capsule of incendiary chemical that ignited on impact. When an API round hit a tree, it didn't just strike the wood, it smashed through the fibers and set them on fire. It turned hard cover into kindling. Miller mixed these rounds with tracers, glowing flares that would let him see his fire in the dark. The standard mix was 1 tracer for every 5 bullets. Miller changed it to 1 in 3. He wanted a solid stream of light. He wanted to be able to write his name in the jungle. He loaded the 4 tombstone ammunition chests, bolted them to the sides of the turret, and fed the heavy belts into the feed trays. He racked the charging handles on all 4 guns, feeling the heavy springs compress. The weapon was cold, wet, and ready. It was no longer an anti-aircraft battery. It was an electric chainsaw, and Miller was ready to pull the cord. The sun went down, and the jungle turned into a wall of black ink. The rain started again, a heavy tropical downpour that drowned out the sound of the crickets. The infantrymen in their foxholes pulled their ponchos tight and cursed the weather. They couldn't see more than 10 feet. They were blind, wet, and terrified. Then the first probe came. It wasn't the massive Banzai charge yet. It was a reconnaissance by fire. A Japanese heavy machine gun, a Type 92 woodpecker, opened up from the tree line. The muzzle flash flickered like a strobe light in the dark, hidden behind a thicket of bamboo. The bullets cut the air over the heads of the Americans, forcing them to press their faces into the mud. The Japanese gunner was testing them, trying to get the Americans to return fire so he could mark their positions. the American infantry machine guns returned fire, aiming blindly at the muzzle flash. But the Type 92 was well dug in. The .30 caliber rounds from the Americans were just chewing up the bamboo, failing to penetrate the log bunker the Japanese had built. The enemy gunner kept firing, walking his rounds closer to the foxholes. He was pinning the platoon down, keeping their heads low while his comrades moved into position for the main assault. The infantry captain screamed for a mortar team to target the bunker, but in the dark, they couldn't get a fix. The platoon was paralyzed. This was the moment Miller had been waiting for. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. He simply kicked the pedal that engaged the turret drive. The electric motor accelerated, a sound that rose in pitch as the turret swung violently to the left. Miller looked through the reflex sight. The glowing red ring floated in the darkness. He placed the ring directly over the flickering muzzle flash of the Japanese machine gun. He didn't fire a warning shot. He didn't fire a short burst. He clamped his hands down on the butterfly triggers and held them there. All 4 M2 machine guns erupted at once. The sound was physically painful, a rhythmic hammering that vibrated through the chassis of the half-track and shook the ground. The muzzle blast from 450 calibers created a shockwave that blew the rain sideways. The effect downrange was instantaneous and horrific. The 4 streams of tracers, converging perfectly at 200 yards, hit the bamboo thicket like a solid bar of fire. The bamboo didn't just break, it evaporated. The heavy tungsten cord bullets smashed through the green stalks, through the dirt berm, and through the logs of the Japanese bunker. The incendiary tips ignited on impact, creating a shower of sparks that looked like a welding torch cutting through steel. The woodpecker machine gun stopped firing immediately. The bunker itself seemed to disintegrate. The logs shattered into splinters the size of toothpicks. The earth around the position boiled as hundreds of rounds slammed into it every second. Miller held the trigger for 3 full seconds. In that time, he put 150 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition into a space the size of a kitchen table. When he released the triggers, the silence that followed was deafening. The Japanese machine gun was gone. The bamboo thicket was gone. In its place was a smoking, glowing crater of chewed-up vegetation and earth. The American infantrymen slowly lifted their heads from the mud. They looked at the devastation, then back at the half-track. They weren't laughing anymore. The captain, who had threatened to shoot Miller earlier, stood up in his foxhole with his mouth open. He had just watched a vehicle he called a toy delete a fortified bunker in the time it took to take a breath. The target magnet had just become the biggest stick in the valley, but the Japanese were not easily discouraged. They had watched the tracers too. They saw exactly where the fire had come from. They realized that the Americans had a new weapon, something that could cut through their cover like paper. The Japanese commander in the jungle blew a whistle. It was a sharp, trilling sound that cut through the rain. It was the signal for escalation. They knew they couldn't win a firefight against the Quadmount. They had to destroy it. They began to shift their heavy weapons. A Type 41 mountain gun, a 75mm artillery piece, was wheeled forward through the mud. Mortar teams adjusted their base plates, aiming not at the foxholes, but at the massive silhouette of the half-track. Miller heard the whistle. He knew what it meant. He had revealed his position. He was now the priority target for every Japanese soldier in the sector. He checked his ammunition chests. He had burned through the first layer of belts, but he had thousands of rounds left. He looked at the temperature gauges on the guns. The barrels were warm, but not hot. The air-cooling sleeves were doing their job. He reached down and adjusted the gas flow on the generator, revving it up to ensure the batteries stayed topped off. He needed max power for the traverse motor. He knew the next attack wouldn't come from one direction. It would come from everywhere. The jungle began to wake up. Red flares popped in the sky, drifting down to mark the American perimeter. The Japanese mortars opened up. The shells fell closer this time, walking toward the half-track. Mud and shrapnel deflected off the armored sides of the vehicle. Miller didn't flinch. He sat in his bucket seat, surrounded by a cage of steel mesh, staring into the green hell. He lowered the guns again, dipping the barrels until they were almost horizontal. He wasn't hunting snipers anymore. He was preparing to mow the lawn. Out in the darkness, the Banzai chant began. It started low, a murmur of hundreds of voices chanting in unison. Tenno Haika Banzai, long live the Emperor. It grew louder, a rising tide of fanaticism. They were psyching themselves up, preparing to die. The infantrymen in the foxholes gripped their rifles, their knuckles white. They looked at the wall of trees, knowing that behind it was a human wave that wouldn't stop for anything. They looked back at Miller. They weren't looking at him with disgust now. They were looking at him with hope. They realized that the only thing standing between them and a massacre was the kid in the bucket seat and his 4 electric guns. The mockery was dead. The MacGyver solution was proven. Now the escalation was about to hit the breaking point. The jungle went silent one last time, taking a breath before the scream. Miller spun the turret left, then right, loosening up the gears. He put his thumbs on the butterfly switches. "Come and get it," he whispered. The jungle didn't just explode, it seemed to vomit men. The Banzai charge was not a tactical maneuver in the Western sense. It was a spiritual event, a collective decision by an entire battalion to trade their lives for a breakthrough. They poured out of the tree line like water bursting through a dam, a solid, screaming mass of humanity, moving with a terrifying singular purpose. They weren't running to cover, they were running to kill. The distance between the jungle edge and the American foxholes was 80 yards. A man in good shape could sprint that distance in 10 seconds. The American infantrymen had 10 seconds to stop 1,000 men. The riflemen in the perimeter did their job. They fired their M1 Garands as fast as they could pull the triggers. The 8-round clips ejected with a metallic sound, and they shoved fresh ones in, burning their fingers on hot barrels. The 30 caliber machine gunners clamped their triggers down, sweeping their fire back and forth across the front of the wave. But it wasn't enough. The physics of the situation were against them. A standard rifle bullet hits one man and stops. Even if every American shot killed a target, there were simply too many targets. The Japanese soldiers in the front fell, but their bodies just became stepping stones for the men behind them. The wave didn't slow down, it accelerated. The momentum of the charge was like a freight train with no brakes. To the men in the foxholes, the world narrowed down to a terrifying tunnel vision. They saw the bayonets glinting in the light of the flares. They saw the faces of the attackers, twisted into masks of fury. They saw the inevitability of their own death. The Japanese were 40 yards away, then 30. The American grenades were gone. The machine gun barrels were glowing cherry red and starting to warp. The infantry captain, who had spent the last 3 days trying to get the half-track sent away, gripped his carbine and prepared for the end. He knew that once the wave hit the foxholes, it would be a knife fight, and in a knife fight against 1,000 men you lose. Then the air behind them tore open. Sergeant Red Miller didn't fire a burst. He didn't fire a warning shot. He simply slammed his thumbs onto the butterfly switches and locked his elbows. The M45 Quadmount roared. The sound wasn't like a machine gun. It was a continuous, tearing noise, like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart by a god. It was a physical wall of pressure that slammed into the backs of the infantrymen and washed over them. The muzzle blast from 4 50 caliber machine guns, firing simultaneously, created a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the air. The effect on the charging wave was instantaneous and absolute. Miller had set his convergence for 200 yards, but the enemy was closer than that. This meant his 4 streams of fire hadn't fully merged yet. They were 4 separate sides of flame cutting through the dark. The tracers, loaded 1 and 3, created a solid beam of light that looked like a laser. Where that beam touched the enemy line, the line simply vanished. The 50 caliber round is a massive projectile. It doesn't just poke holes. It smashes bone and liquefies tissue. When 4 of them hit a human body at the same split second, the result is not a wound. It is a disassembly. The front rank of the Banzai charge didn't fall down. They were physically pushed backward, lifted off their feet by the sheer kinetic energy of the impact. It looked like they had run into an invisible glass wall at full speed. The men behind them were hit by the shrapnel of their own comrades and the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that punched through the first target to kill the second and third. Miller swept the turret from left to right. The electric motor emitted a rising tone, spinning the heavy guns with terrifying speed. He didn't have to fight the recoil. The heavy mount absorbed it all. He just pointed the electric chainsaw and watched the world disappear. The tracer stream hit the center of the charge. It was like watching a fire hose wash away mud. The mass of Japanese infantry, which had looked unstoppable seconds ago, evaporated into a pink mist. The meat chopper nickname wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal description of what happens when 2,000 heavy caliber rounds per minute hit a crowd of people. The jungle edge itself began to disintegrate. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds didn't stop when they hit flesh. They continued into the tree line. The tungsten cores smashed through the mahogany trunks. The incendiary tips ignited on impact. The trees didn't just catch fire, they exploded into splinters. Massive branches, sheared off by the volume of lead, crashed down onto the attacking troops. The brush caught fire, casting a hellish red glow over the killing field. Miller was literally deforestation the landscape in real time. He was cutting the jungle down to ground level, removing the enemy's cover by removing the forest itself. But the Japanese were not done. The initial wave had been shattered, but the heavy weapons teams in the rear were still active. The mountain gun Miller had worried about fired. A 75mm shell screamed out of the darkness and exploded 20 yards to the left of the half-track. The concussion rocked the vehicle, rattling Miller's teeth and spraying mud over his optical sight. Shrapnel deflected off the armored bat-wing shields that protected his seat. Miller didn't flinch. He didn't try to wipe the mud off his sight. He knew where the shot had come from. He had seen the muzzle flash in the trees, a brief yellow flower that bloomed and died. He spun the turret toward it. He didn't need to be precise. He didn't need to thread a needle. He just needed to saturate the grid square. He depressed the guns slightly and unleashed a 5-second burst. 5 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but in the world of the Quadmount, 5 seconds is 160 rounds of 50 caliber hate. The tracers drew a line straight to the hidden artillery piece. The rounds smashed into the gun shield, punched through the wheels, and shredded the crew. The ammunition stacked near the gun took a hit. A secondary explosion blossomed in the trees, a violent orange fireball that told Miller he had connected. The mountain gun fell silent. The Japanese mortar teams were next. They were trying to walk their rounds onto the half-track, sensing that it was the anchor of the American defense. Miller saw the sparks of the launch tubes. He traversed the turret right, the motors humming a high-pitched note of aggression. He walked his fire into the mortar pits. The incendiary rounds set the camouflage netting on fire. The heavy slugs churned the earth, burying the mortars and the men operating them in a landslide of dirt and lead. It was a duel between indirect fire, and direct fire was winning. Miller was working in a trance state. The heat from the 4 barrels was radiating back at him, washing over his face in waves. The smell of burning gunpowder and ozone was thick in his nose. The vibration of the guns rattled his bones, but his hands were steady on the control yoke. He was playing the turret like an instrument. He swung left to catch a group of stragglers trying to flank the foxholes. He swung right to hammer a sniper trying to climb a tree. He was the eye of the storm, the pivot point around which the entire battle revolved. The infantrymen in the foxholes had stopped firing. They realized they were just wasting ammunition. They watched in awe as the stream of tracers swept back and forth, a glowing whip that cracked the air. They saw Japanese soldiers, who moments ago had been terrifying warriors, throw themselves into the mud to escape the scythe. The psychological impact was total. The Banzai spirit relied on the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material superiority. Miller was proving that belief wrong, 2,000 rounds at a time. A second wave tried to form up in the ravine. They were screaming, trying to regain the momentum. Miller heard them. He spun the turret 180 degrees, facing the rear. The half-track was open-topped, vulnerable, but the turret could cover every angle. He elevated the guns slightly, aiming for the lip of the ravine. He fired blind, using the tracers to guide him. The rounds arched over the edge and plunged into the depression. The screaming changed pitch. It went from a war cry to a cry of panic. The ricochets bounced around the rocky ravine, creating a kill zone that no one could survive. The second wave broke before it could even crest the hill. The barrels were getting hot now. Miller could see them glowing a dull red in the darkness, even through the cooling jackets. The grease on the actions was smoking. He knew he had to be careful. If the barrels got too hot, the rounds could cook off, firing spontaneously from the heat of the chamber. But he couldn't stop. The enemy was still moving. He fired shorter bursts now, 1 second, 2 seconds, just enough to suppress movement, just enough to remind them that the dragon was still awake. He checked his ammunition status. The 4 tombstone chests were running low. He could feel the difference in the weight of the belts hanging from the feed trays. He kicked the empty brass casings away from his feet. The floor of the turret was ankle-deep in spent shells. They cascaded out of the ejection ports like a golden waterfall, jingling as they piled up. He shouted to the infantryman nearest the truck, "Ammo, get me ammo." 2 privates, the same ones who had laughed at his toy earlier that day, scrambled out of their foxhole. They didn't hesitate. They ran to the back of the half-track, grabbed fresh ammunition chests from the reserve rack, and climbed up the side of the vehicle. They ignored the Japanese bullets passing overhead. They popped the latches on the mount, pulled the empty chests, and slammed the fresh ones home. Miller racked the charging handles. The infantrymen jumped off, patting the side of the truck like it was a prize horse. They were part of the crew now. The Dragon wagon belonged to all of them. The battle raged for another hour, but the outcome had been decided in those first 30 seconds. The Japanese could not cross the open ground. The ground convergence zone Miller had set up was an impassable line of death. Every time a squad tried to rush it, Miller erased them. The volume of fire was simply too high. You couldn't run through raindrops, and you couldn't run through the Quadmount spray. Slowly, the Japanese fire began to slacken. The Banzai chants faded. The survivors were slipping away, crawling back into the deep jungle, leaving their dead behind. They had run into a technological buzzsaw, and it had cost them everything. Miller didn't relax. He kept the turret spinning, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. He fired a few bursts into the suspicious shadows just to be sure. The sun began to crest the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. The rain stopped. The smoke from the burning jungle hung low over the clearing, a thick, acrid fog. Miller finally released the spade handles. His hands were cramped into claws. His ears were ringing so loud he couldn't hear the engine idling beneath him. He looked out at the field in front of the truck. It didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked like a landscaping project gone wrong. The jungle edge had been pushed back 50 yards. The trees were gone, reduced to jagged stumps and splinters. The ground was churned into a reddish mud, mixed with the debris of the attack, and everywhere there were bodies, hundreds of them. They weren't piled in neat lines. They were scattered and broken, evidence of the terrible power of the heavy machine gun. Miller reached down and killed the generator. The humming vibration stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavy and sudden. He slumped in the bucket seat, suddenly exhausted. He felt the adrenaline crash hitting him, his hands starting to shake. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, but his fingers were too numb to work the lighter. A figure climbed up onto the side of the track. It was the infantry captain. He looked at the devastation downrange. He looked at the pile of brass casings that buried Miller's feet. He looked at the glowing barrels of the Quadmount. He didn't say anything about air defense. He didn't mention the ammo budget. He just struck a match, lit Miller's cigarette, and nodded. The meat chopper had spoken, and it had the final word. The sun rose over Luzon at 0600 hours, burning through the morning mist to reveal a landscape that had been fundamentally altered. The clearing in front of the half-track was no longer a jungle. It was a wasteland. The majestic mahogany trees that had stood for 100 years were gone, reduced to jagged, splintered stumps that looked like broken teeth. The dense undergrowth, which had been a wall of green vines and bamboo, had been chewed into a mulch of mud and sawdust. The ground itself was churned and blackened, scarred by the impact of thousands of 50 caliber rounds and the scorch marks of the incendiary chemicals. It looked less like a battlefield and more like the site of a natural disaster, as if a tornado made of fire had touched down and sat in one spot for an hour. To the infantrymen peering over the rims of their foxholes, the destruction was absolute. They had seen artillery barrages before, and they had seen airstrikes, but this was different. This was precise, intimate destruction delivered from a range of 50 yards. Sergeant Red Miller sat in the bucket seat of the Quadmount, staring at the devastation with eyes that felt like they were filled with sand. He was soaked to the bone, not just from the rain, but from a mixture of sweat, oil, and the carbon residue that coated every inch of the turret. His hands were still cramped into claws around the spade grips, locked in place by hours of tension. He tried to let go, but his fingers wouldn't obey immediately. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the night was gone, replaced by a hollow, crushing exhaustion. He felt heavy, as if gravity had doubled its pull. The silence of the morning was louder than the gunfire had been. There were no birds singing. There were no insects buzzing. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal as the 4 heavy barrels contracted in the damp air. The infantry captain climbed up the side of the half-track. This was the same officer who, 24 hours earlier, had called the vehicle a target magnet and threatened to shoot Miller for giving away their position. He pulled himself over the armor plate and stood in the turret tub. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked down at the floor. The entire bottom of the turret was buried in spent brass casings. It looked like a drift of golden snow, shin-deep in places. Thousands of empty shells shifted softly as the captain shifted his weight. He looked at the empty ammunition chests, the scorched paint on the gun shields, and the pile of burnt-out barrels that Miller had swapped out during the lull. Then he looked out at the tree line, or what was left of it. He saw the mounds of enemy dead, piled in the convergence zone where Miller had focused his fire. He saw the path the Banzai charge had taken, a path that ended abruptly at the wall of lead. The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out a crushed pack of Lucky Strikes. He tapped one out, put it between his lips, and then offered the pack to Miller. It was a small gesture, but in the language of the front line, it was an apology, a commendation, and a thank you note all rolled into one. Miller took the cigarette with a shaking hand. The captain lit it for him, cupping the flame against the morning breeze. They smoked in silence for a minute, watching the smoke drift over the ruined jungle. The captain finally spoke, his voice raspy and quiet. He didn't offer a speech about heroism. He just said that he would make sure the supply trucks brought up extra ammo tonight. He told Miller to get some sleep. Then he climbed down and walked back to his men. The argument was over. The Dragon Wagon wasn't a liability anymore. It was the anchor of the line. The vindication of the M45 Quadmount spread through the division like wildfire. The infantrymen, who had previously looked at the anti-aircraft crews with disdain, now treated them like royalty. When the supply trucks arrived, the riflemen volunteered to help load the heavy ammunition crates. They dug new revetments for the half-tracks, piling sandbags high to protect the tires and the engine. They shared their rations with the gunners. They understood now that the meat chopper was the only thing standing between them and the human waves. The nickname stuck. It wasn't the Dragon Wagon anymore. It was the meat chopper, a grim but affectionate title that described exactly what the weapon did to an infantry assault. The Japanese learned the lesson too. Intelligence reports intercepted later showed that Japanese commanders had issued orders to avoid sectors defended by the four-headed machine gun. They called it the Devil's Breath. They stopped launching Banzai charges against Miller's position. The weapon had achieved the ultimate victory. It had terrified the enemy into changing their entire strategy. Miller survived the Philippines. He survived the push into the mountains and the final battles for the island. The war ended in August of 1945, but the legacy of the weapon he had wielded was just beginning. The military brass, who had initially scoffed at using anti-aircraft guns for ground support, couldn't ignore the after-action reports. They saw the body counts. They saw the effectiveness of the electric chainsaw in dense terrain. The M45 didn't go to the scrapyard with the rest of the war's surplus. It stayed in the inventory. 5 years later, when the North Korean army poured over the 38th parallel, the Quadmount was there to meet them. In the frozen hills of Korea, the weapon found a new generation of believers. The Chinese army used the same human wave tactics as the Japanese, attacking in massive numbers with bugles blowing in the night. And just like in Luzon, the Quadmounts were waiting. The soldiers in Korea gave it a new nickname, the Chicom Chopper. They mounted the turrets on trucks, on half-tracks, and even in sandbagged bunkers on the front line. The dense waves of Chinese infantry would rush the American positions, only to run into the same wall of converging fire that Miller had perfected. The Quadmount became the most feared weapon of the Korean War, a machine that could break an assault simply by turning it into a slaughter. 2 decades later, the weapon evolved again. In the jungles of Vietnam, the American convoys were getting hammered by ambushes. The Viet Cong would hide in the dense tree lines along the roads and rake the supply trucks with automatic fire. The army needed a weapon that could react instantly and deliver overwhelming firepower. They remembered the lesson of the meat chopper. They took the old M45 turrets out of storage, stripped off the old gasoline generators, and bolted them to the beds of 5-ton cargo trucks. They built armor boxes around them and painted them black. They called them gun trucks. When a convoy was ambushed, the gun truck would spin its turret and unleash 4 streams of 50 caliber hate into the jungle. It was the same tactic Miller had used in 1945, proving that while technology changes, the physics of overkill remain the same. Sergeant Red Miller returned to the United States in late 1945. He took off the uniform and went back to civilian life in Ohio. He got a job at a steel mill, working the blast furnaces. It was hot, loud, dangerous work, but it was quiet compared to the inside of the Quadmount turret. He married, raised 3 kids, and coached Little League Baseball. He was a quiet man, the kind of guy who sat at the end of the bar and nursed a beer without saying much. He never talked about the war. He never told his wife about the night the jungle tried to kill him. He never described what it looked like when a man is hit by 4 50 caliber bullets at the same time. Sometimes on the 4th of July, when the fireworks were exploding and the air smelled of sulfur, his family would notice him staring off into the distance, his hands gripping the arms of his lawn chair a little too tight. They assumed he was just lost in thought. They didn't know he was back in the bucket seat, feeling the vibration of the generator and watching the tracers burn a hole in the dark. He kept the secret of the red mist locked away in the back of his mind, a burden he carried so his children wouldn't have to. He died in 1998, a grandfather who fixed toasters and loved to fish. The neighbors knew him as a nice old man. They had no idea he was once the god of thunder in a Philippine jungle. The story of the M45 Quadmount is more than just a story about a piece of machinery. It is a story about the disconnect between the manual and the reality. The experts designed a weapon to shoot down planes. They wrote books on how to use it, calculated the math, and drew the diagrams. But when the chips were down and the enemy was screaming at the wire, it took a 22-year-old kid to throw the book away and use the tool in a way that saved lives. Miller proved that a weapon is defined by the man holding it. He proved that overkill is just a word used by people who have never been overrun. We tell these stories because men like Red Miller don't write memoirs. They don't go on talk shows. They come home, put their medals in a shoebox, and go to work. They fade into the background, content to let the history books focus on the generals and the politicians. But it wasn't the generals who stopped the Banzai charge on Luzon. It was a mechanic with a wrench and a bad attitude. It was the grind of the turret motor and the mountain of brass casings. We rescue these stories to ensure that Red Miller and the thousands of gunners like him don't disappear into silence. If this deep dive into the meat chopper got your heart racing, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real history, with all its grit and fury, matters. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We are digging through the archives every week to bring you the legendary machines and the forgotten heroes of the war. Drop a comment below. Would you have fired the Quadmount or would you have stayed in the foxhole? Let us know. We read every single comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering, and we'll see you in the next foxhole.